today's webinar is about one of our products, HMS, a cloud-based software platform that provides cities and regions with the capability to create, enhance, and extend community transit services by forming goal-specific collaborations with commercial ride providers. So it gives the city transportation managers a simple way to specify the level and kind of services that are desired in the city. It provides a unique ability to integrate these commercial services with existing transit to best serve the needs defined by that community. So with HMS, cities will be able to generate transit service improvements and cost savings while creating an open marketplace for ride services and a governance framework for managing new future mobility fleets. So at this stage of the game, I think I'd like to pass it on to Bern to kick in. Actually, maybe before I do that, maybe we'll just play with the software a little bit, and I'm gonna see if I can launch a simple poll. So as attendees, I'm gonna send this poll to you, and you can take a minute to think about the question and provide your answers. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and I'm going to show you the results. Okay, so have TNCs improved overall transportation in your city? So 50% are saying yes. We've got a pretty large percentage who don't know and a handful that say no. So we're going to talk a little bit more about TNCs and touch on kind of all three of these answers, yes, no, and I don't know, because they're all relevant answers and meaningful. And I think a lot of the material that Bern is about to present is really relevant for this really simple question. So without any further ado, it's on to you, Bern.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank all of you for joining us today, and welcome all of you to this webinar. As Jerry described, HMS is a digital governance platform to be used by agencies, primarily by agencies such as transit or transportation or planning agencies or other governmental agencies that would like to address and manage the changes that have already started to affect commercial for-hire mobility in our cities. There's changes that we expect will continue to expand and stress our current mobility governance systems over the next 2 or more decades, as it has for the past decade. The HMS platform is designed to promote and manage partnerships between commercial transportation providers and transit agencies. It provides a new way to specify and regulate commercial service providers and a way to integrate these commercial services with public transit systems. HMS can turn commercial ride-hailing services into transit and transit-like services. And we've already seen this in several instances, independent of our work, of course, and I will touch on some of those shortly. There's been a number of studies showing TNCs generating congestion, either or additional vehicle kilometers traveled or vehicle miles traveled, or encroaching on transit ridership or on active transportation. The one on the left is well known as the first such study that came out at the beginning of 2017 regarding New York City, and there's been some pretty dramatic responses to that since then, and also something much more recently at the end of 2018 from San Francisco, and there's been several others in between. So this is not a new form of study, and they sort of have a general agreement, but they're not all identical. And however alarmed we may be by these reports and however much we may advocate ride sharing, I'm certainly an advocate for ride hailing, and however much we believe autonomous vehicles will help or harm our urban mobility, the one thing we can all agree on is that we are in a significant time of change for mobility and its technologies. These recent and pending technologies are important, if not critical, to urban mobility, and any opportunity for governance that can maximize that value should be taken, we certainly believe. Hence our work with HMS. This is a study released only a week ago And this was actually done for Uber and Lyft. And it shows portions in 6 different cities, portions of regional vehicle miles traveled from TNCs of anywhere between 1 to 3%. It's kind of a small number regionally. And within the city core, anywhere between 2 and 13%. And that's ranging from a small number to a considerable number in that case. So most of us assume that cities will continue to have fleets of publicly accessible, on-demand ride-hailing vehicles. Many of us also assume that these for-hire vehicles will become driverless reasonably soon, without setting any times, of course, and that for-hire fleets will continue to grow in size and impact, that driverless geofenced constraints will gradually expand, that driverless traffic will be for the foreseeable future mixed with non-automated vehicles, and that vehicle fleets will undergo innumerable changes in terms of regulations, user preferences, technical capabilities, and traffic adjustments on the way to higher usage numbers and to eventual majority acceptance in our cities. In other words, we mostly think that the change to urban mobility and our habits of automobility have barely begun. So how can we manage ourselves through these changes? We believe, we at Harmonized Mobility believe that as mobility is digitized and as more service and vehicle types proliferate, and as various commercial service models could possibly draw away transit customers, or certainly change the relationship with transit, and as such services may change and adjust, that government's ability to respond, to fund, to own and operate transit vehicles, especially large transit vehicles, and retain ridership will likely degrade. At the same time, other opportunities such as collaboration, innovation and service choices, as well as threats such as predatory pricing, growing demand and expectation will open new opportunities and requirements for governance. The key intention of HMS is to provide a way for government to specify and regulate transportation value and equity in this changing world of urban mobility, as government's ability to own and operate will be increasingly challenged. HMS provides a way for government agencies to address immediate opportunities to use commercial ride services such as door-to-door TNCs and corner-to-corner shuttle bus services to extend or optimize current services. HMS also segues directly into automated robotaxi and robo-shuttle fleets when they arrive. HMS is agnostic as to whether a driver or other human assistant is present. We're completely agnostic to that. And we create an open marketplace, or HMS creates an open marketplace for all service providers, legal service providers, to participate in government-led transit integration or government or transit-related programs. So there are 2 important reports over the last couple of years that have acted as guidance for us in our system design and operation for HMS. The first report that I'm going to talk to you about is from the Institute for Transportation Development Policy. It came out early in 2019, or it's quite recent actually. And in their policy framework, the ITDP admit to the complexity and challenge of regulating TNCs. That's not surprising. The report underscores the importance, the primacy and sensitivity of travel data. It is inclusive of pricing as a potential tool. HMS can handle pricing, by the way, but we're agnostic to whether or not that be in place. That's not our role. And what we consider it should be an option for cities and regions to determine. The ITDP framework includes, and you'll see in the center, it includes pricing, metrics, data, and coordination. This is the whole scheme of how this might be updated over time, the ITDP scheme. We're focused just on the 4 things in the center. In particular, ITDP sees pricing to incentivize shared, shorter, or less frequent trips. Again, we're not saying what should be incentivized, but pricing incentivizes lots of behaviors. That metrics would establish baselines to better understand TNC impacts, and what what the data might be used for, and most importantly, what regional coordination would be used for. We're very, very interested in multi-jurisdictional regulation, which you'll see in a few slides on as well. The second report from the UITP is from the UITP, which came out a little bit earlier. And this was mostly focused on autonomous vehicles. I showed you the first one because that was focused on current TNC fleets. So in this case, this came out more than 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, and again about autonomous vehicles. Here, this report, I want to point out, was released 1 month before the original New York City TNC report that I showed earlier. So this came out just before that Bruce Shaw report from New York. And it is this that triggered our initial decision to create HMS, the software platform, recognizing that we would be agnostic to the presence of a human operator. The key concern in the what have I done here? Whoops, sorry. The key concern in this policy brief was that for-hire vehicles should collaborate and integrate with public transit as much as possible. That was the key element. The report specifically focused on connections to existing transit. But we expanded the ideas in this report to consider underserved areas, underserved populations, as well as vehicle type, occupancy, and size. We'll see more of that in a few minutes. And so while HMS addresses the UITP concern for autonomous vehicles, we believe there's an obvious segue from today's for-hire vehicles, such as TNC's taxis and shuttles, into tomorrow's robo-taxis. I don't think that's news to anybody on this call, but that's core to our thinking. One last report just to mention is this report from a little bit more than a year ago, or just about a year ago, from the Chaddick Institute. This is from Joseph Schweiderman, a well-known transit person. This describes some 18 projects in which TNC, specifically Lyft and Uber, engaged with local agencies to provide subsidized rides to people for various reasons that local agencies were not otherwise able to provide with suitable transit services. And we made sure that that HMS data structures and workflow could handle each of these that were in that report as well. Here's one example from this report. I picked this example because it's local to us up here in Ontario. This happens to be from a town of Innisfil, and it's considered one of the best. It's my favorite as well. It's considered one of the best collaborative deployments up to that time, and it's probably still among the best, if not the best. In this case, the supplier happened to be Uber, and if you look at this sort of short table of what the subsidies were, you can see that there were a system of fixed subsidies depending on the context of the trip. In this case, this is what the town wanted to be sure to incentivize. Jerry, that's the beginning of the introduction. You gonna do another poll?
Yeah, thanks, Bern. I'm going to launch another poll at this stage of the game. Just give me a minute. All right. Now, we promised not to have anything too complicated here, so this is in line with that. So you've got a moment. We're going to take about a minute to get some answers to this poll. So I get to see in real time how the answers are going, so I have a distinct advantage to everyone else. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. Going, gone. Okay, so we have a vast majority who think collaborating with ride providers is a good idea. And certainly Bern and I, we're not allowed to answer the poll results, but we agree. We see tremendous opportunity, and so I'll just pass it back to you, Bern, to go a little bit deeper into this.
Okay, so talking about the HMS solution in particular, I'm going to look at the purpose, operation, and process. As purpose goes, we focus on specify and regulate as an approach by the local transportation authority. You'll see others involved besides just transportation authorities. However, this is the core and principal purpose. We permit government agencies, or HMS permits government agencies to specify and regulate via incentives rather than caps or limits. We don't have any, well, our opinion about caps and limits is beside the point. Our value is being able to specify and regulate, and hopefully to reduce caps and limits as not necessarily the best management technique. In any case, keeping my private opinions aside, here the endpoint data is used to audit the ride and in order to award subsidies and are aggregated to transit agency specification. The HMS permits integration with transit as well as across jurisdiction boundaries, and as well, it aggregates subsidies from government and retailers and employers. I'm going to go into that a little bit more later, but it is agnostic to who it is that is subsidizing the ride, because we think that's critical as well. We are agnostic as to whether the ride provider is human operated or autonomous. As I mentioned earlier, it's set up for government oversight. So the principal client is the transit agency or the government transportation agency. It delivers performance incentives that users are aware of, and they would make their decisions based on those incentives. User fees are optional and are more likely to be used later for autonomous fleets. We're inclusive of user fees, but it's not required, of course. And the money goes in between the subsidizer and the ride provider. We don't handle money, and each subsidy is on a per trip basis, which is a little bit different than a lot of transit subsidies are today. HMS can be focused on any number of forms of equity, whether it's social equity or environmental. In other words, you can subsidize someone in the transit desert, or you might subsidize a fuel type, or you might subsidize occupancy, or you might subsidize local transit through local taxi services for employment reasons. There's a lot of different ways that the subsidies can be set up for any of these forms of equity or justice. We govern ride services for any number of, I'll call them performance metrics, whether it's underserved populations or underserved areas. Sometimes those are correlated, but nonetheless, it can be either area or a demographic. It may be occupancy, fuel type, obviously first, last mile, of course, disabled and seniors and so on. So it's all about addressing a measurable trip performance or trip behavior, or vehicle behavior, if you want to look at it that way. And populations such as disabled or employees or named customers need to be in a registry. So it's like first, last mile doesn't need to be in a registry, but seniors would need to be, and so on. So we handle both, but there's a difference there as well. We support all markets and industries. Again, I mentioned earlier, retailers or employers in addition to public transit. It could be developers who are putting in a new area, in a new subdivision, and they need to attract buyers to their homes prior to any bus system going in, for example. Or maybe it's not worth running a bus because of density, and maybe this is a way for them to get transportation for those customers, for example. So we're agnostic to that as well. We're also agnostic as to fleet types. So whether it's, all that matters is that the fleet's on the network. So if it's a fleet of bikes or a fleet of scooters or a fleet of taxis or a fleet of buses, these are all need to be on demand. So it could be an on-demand bus, like a shuttle bus and so forth. It could even be membership clubs and so on. So it doesn't matter the owner or operator of the fleet. What matters is that they're on the network and that they're willing to put their vehicles out with or without drivers and so forth. what's really important is why it's important that HMS be independent. In other words, the value proposition of an independent management system like this is that we can aggregate across jurisdictions, for example. So you come to a region that has 25 or 30 municipalities or more in the region. This permits that region to subscribe, each municipality subscribing their own way with their own set of rules. However, a user that may move across multiple municipalities, those jurisdictions, would have those subsidies aggregated as that person uses the transportation system within and across those areas and so forth. It also aggregates across service providers so that a city or a region can take advantage of multiple service providers instead of just one, so they don't have to choose one, for example. There's a single procurement process. We can pool subsidies, for example, that we can, a person might take the example of leaving a transit desert. There's a subsidy for that from the city or the municipality that that's in, and then going to, for example, a pharmacy in which there's a subsidy for a senior to pick up their drugs, for example, and we would consolidate those, we would aggregate those subsidies, for example. So there's really a lot of reasons for this to be independent. There's value all across the board, including because of its ability to aggregate all of these things. It provides new growth opportunities for hire vehicle providers, including TNCs, of course. We see it an advantage for them as well.
So Bern, before you move from that slide, I have a question I think is relevant in the context from Jeff Becker. Jeff wants to know, you emphasize TNCs, but what about taxis and other for-hire vehicles? I just want to get clear on that one.
We're agnostic to, and that's what I'm saying in here, we're agnostic to who, that's in the second line, the second bullet includes taxi at first. We're agnostic to the nature of the commercial provider. It's just that they are approved by the municipality that's subsidized. It has to be approved by the subsidizer, and it has to be on the network. Otherwise, for us, it's all the same.
Yeah, and I think the key point is those those ride providers need to be able to provide us with the origin and destination data in order for us to kind of calculate that subsidy. So if it's a taxi system that cannot provide that data, they wouldn't work, but anybody else works.
Yeah, we interface through an API, so the taxi company, which is, I mean, in Toronto, there's, for example, in many cities, many of the taxi companies are now hailable. Not all, but many are, and those that are hailable are automatically. Well, I don't say the word automatic. They're eligible as long as the subsidizer says yes. What we hope to happen is that the subsidizer doesn't care who it is. The subsidizer says, we're going to pay $4 for people to get off at the train station, and we don't care if the taxi company takes you there, or Lyft takes you there, or Ford's automated vehicle takes you there. That the deal is we're willing to subsidize that ride. So we intend to be out.
And so one more question that just came in from Fabrizio is, why do you keep mentioning subsidies? Why is that necessary?
Well, that's generally how most of the, so the subsidy doesn't have to be cash. It can be for a retailer, it might be coupons. But somewhere, if we're going to encourage people who cannot afford for hire vehicle now to stop using their own vehicle, part of this is about having people use their own vehicle less or own vehicles less, then that may need to be subsidized. That's
yeah, like subsidy in public transit is not a new thing, and so what we're suggesting is that we use those subsidies to drive the behavior that we want. We use them a little bit smarter on a per ride or per goal oriented basis. So that's why subsidy, because these subsidies are designed to extend and enhance or create public transit in a different format that connects in with your existing public transit.
We've been to visit with a lot of clients who say that in a rural area, they're paying on the order of anywhere between $15 to $25 a boarding for bus transit users. That's because the buses are underused. And they would then be able to, in fact, that's what happened in Innisfil. The per transit user, the per bus boarding subsidy would have been so high in Innisfil they couldn't afford the bus system. Whereas you saw in the earlier chart, there was I'm using the word subsidy, it was a payment of anywhere between $3 and $5 for those rides. So that's what I mean by subsidy. So it actually, in the right time, in the right places, it saves government a lot of money and provides a much more convenient access for users. Anyway, we can return to that if there's still a question.
Yeah.
So let's look a little bit at the operation. So what happens is the data flow or the workflow or the information flow is at the Transportation Authority. That's the primary source of this. We're not going to do this without a Transportation Authority saying so. They would specify the preferred fleet behavior, and I gave several examples of what that might be like. And they would say what the subsidies, and again, fees is here as well, because maybe there's massive fleets in the future, 10 years from now, there's massive fleets of robo-taxis, for example, and they may pay road fees, and those road fees may be doubled back into the system to pay for transit deserts or pay for people that can't afford it and so forth. How that's balanced is up to the Transportation Authority. We can help them with that balance, but it's not our role to say what subsidies should be or not, and what fees should be or not. But we handle both. It goes into our platform as data, we call it the incentives platform. From there, any ride hailing or any on-demand or any for-hire fleet of any kind can use that, can access those subsidies for users who want to ride. So with the value to users that they have more choice. So imagine in a city where the user can say, I need to get from A to B, and there might be 3 taxi companies and 2 TNCs and a corner-to-corner bus, and might have 6 things to choose from. I'll show you that example in a minute, and we'll make that choice. I also want to underscore before I leave this slide is that retailers and employers are included as well. Think of a retailer that wants to, that's run out of the parking space or would like to sell the parking lot to build a building and make a lot more money than parking cars, and therefore offers the employees a subsidy to take, let's say, a TNC to work, for example. I don't think that's a new idea. This thinking is current in our industry already. So I want you to think about HMS as within a Moz ecosystem. I'm using the word ecosystem as a generalized Moz concept. I'm not talking about Moz Global necessarily, because in my opinion, user services from TNCs now are a type of Moz system in the sense that it is mobility as a service. So I don't care how constrained or how generalized that system is. HMS operates within that kind of an environment, and it operates in 2 ways. And as a clearinghouse or distributor, or auditor and invoice aggregator for trip-related micro-subsidies, it has 2 modes. It operates in the foreground or in the background. I want to show each of those. So all that's happening is that in between the ride providers and the users, there's a filter that determines whether there's a subsidy and grants that subsidy. So here it is in foreground mode. It's visible to the user. The user has an app on their smartphone and they say, I'd like to go from A to B. And in the smartphone says, here are all the ways you can get there. Now this again is almost a Moz system, but not really, because we don't handle payment and we're not a direct tie into mass transit. So for example, today's TNCs are linking more and more directly with mass transit in some cities. So if you were to select one of the TNCs this way, they would connect you to transit, for example. So we don't do that because it would be redundant for us to do that. We don't collect the money because it's redundant to do that as well. We're simply auditing this exchange. In this case, the user sees our system and is completely and absolutely aware of the government subsidy. In the background mode, the user is unaware of us or could be unaware of us. The user then asks any Moz app, could even ask one of the TNC apps and say, I want to go from A to B, which they do now, been doing for 10 years, do the same thing. And of course, now mass transit is more and more included in trip finders and more Moz apps, obviously. And so now the user asks for the trip and asks from that Moz app which one they're going to take, or maybe the Moz app is directly one of the TNCs and it actually goes directly to that TNC Moz app and chooses that one, for example. That's fine. That Moz app asks us what subsidy is available, and we just serve that information back to them. Remember, we still have to audit it. We have to audit it so that we can tell the subsidized the trip was actually taken and that the invoice back to the provider is payable. So here it is in visible mode. So in this case, there is 2 taxis. Those are the top 2 or 2 taxi companies. They're in 2 different cities, but it doesn't matter. Those are 2 taxis. And then of course there's 2 TNCs, very familiar. And there's this VIA is a corner to corner shuttle, kind of a bus system. So the user says, I want to go from A to B. And this is visible mode. So visible mode, they're actually on our app in this case. And they review their ride subsidy choices. So in this simple example, there's 5 choices that could satisfy that origin destination. And it's listed for them. It says, here's the 5 choices you have. Which one would you like? One is picked. And what happens when it's selected is the decision is immediately flipped over to the one that's chosen. So in this example, one of the TNCs were chosen. So it then flips over to that TNC app, it's just passed on like a baton, and a code is passed on, says there's a subsidy. In other words, here's a ride for you, and there's a $4 subsidy if you provide this ride. And of course, that TNC decides whether or not to provide the ride. Still up to them. They could reject it if they wanted to. At the end of which we have a confirmation cycle that says, yes, indeed, that ride was actually taken, because maybe the subsidy is to go to a train station and somewhere along the line they didn't get out at the train station, they got off somewhere else. So then that ride would not be confirmable in that case. But let's say it is confirmed, it's completed as promised and as the subsidy was promised. So we confirm that match. Now we have to credit the ride provider. So in this example, we would credit the taxi company or the TNC company and so forth, whichever one was selected by the user. And then we invoice and we provide the data as required of the city, and then we invoice on behalf of the ride provider. We invoice the city to make that payment to that ride provider. That could be aggregated weekly or daily or annually. That doesn't matter, not annually, but it may be aggregated weekly or monthly. That's not the point. The point is that we create the invoice on behalf of, but we do not collect the money. So that's the operation. That's how it operates. Here's the quick process, very, very quick. We scope out a city or region or town, what it is that they would like to do in terms of these subsidies. It has to be set up. You can imagine the geographies and the schedules and the times and the amounts for the subsidies or prices. And we need to decide how the data is to be aggregated, because not every city wants it the same way. Some cities want it in detail, some cities don't, and so forth, how it would be reported and how frequent invoices would occur for each ride provider and so forth. And sometimes there's registries for, maybe registries for their seniors, for example. Then a lot of things have to do to test that and set up a promotional program for that town or city or region, and then finally announce it to the public and then launch the system. That's how that would appear. So I'm just going to tell you a couple of quick case studies. I just have 4 or 5 more slides, then we're going to be finished on time. So here's a case study in the Bay Area, and these case studies are all in discussion. So I'm not showing you any completed system. These are systems under discussion. So there happens to be a bridge in the Bay Area, which has a lot of residential housing on one side of the bridge, and on the other side is a lot of employment. So you can appreciate that every morning, everybody who lives north of the bridge goes over the bridge and works in south of the bridge, which is a very clever way to fill a bridge full of cars. And the parking area, which is on the residential side of the bridge, is filled up very early in the morning, which happens in a lot of these kinds of transit-related parking lots. And they don't want to expand the parking lot. I don't blame them. And so it's full. So your choice is, because you can't park your car and take the bus across the bridge, your choice is to drive. And so the idea here is to subsidize for hire vehicles, whether those are TNCs, or it doesn't matter what they are to this scheme. They may be shuttles, or they may be TNCs. There may be pooling, ride pooling, and so forth. And so they would just bring people to that BRT instead of parking. So it's a very simple idea. Here's a case in a large Canadian city where there is a shift work. This is hospital oriented. There's also some factory oriented, where shift work starts or stops at a time where the bus is not running. So people could take the bus to work, but then can't get home, or they could, they would need to drive to work, but then they could take the bus home, except they have their car. So this idea is called guaranteed ride home or guaranteed ride to work, in which you only need the subsidization one way, because you can take transit the other way. So in this case, the city is looking at subsidizing half of a round trip in that example. Here's another city, and there's a lot of cities like this where bus routes are underused. Very small towns, bus routes are underused altogether, but they may be underused at the city edge. This is a mid-sized city of, I think, 100,000 people, if I'm recalling, and the bus routes are underused at the city's edge. The idea is to use HMS to subsidize for hire vehicles, to bring people from the city edge, the farther suburbs, to the edge of the city to take transit that is running, and to increase the frequency of transit in the city, so that people now have more frequent bus systems, but the bus systems are not running out to the edge and so forth. Exactly the same thing in a small Ontario city, as I just explained in that small Illinois city. Here's another large Canadian city, and they're looking at the entire region of to unify the entire regional transportation system. All the things that we've mentioned, whether it's seniors or fuel type or first class model, considering all of it, to manage all of it this way, to manage their not only their immediate taxi and TNC providers, but also to manage the future of autonomous vehicles as well. So that's a few of the case studies. I think I'm finished the major slides.
Yeah, thanks, Bern. I've had a bunch of questions coming in as you've been presenting, and I've been holding off. So maybe we can, before we do another poll, let's answer some of these questions. So the first question from Alex Price is, this does seem to be very much focused on motorized transport. How about cycling and walking? Which has software supplies which can record distances and routes, and this would free up transport systems and should have subsidies assigned to them. So, what is around active transportation? How do we play in that role?
Right. So in one of the slides, I mentioned that the fleet merely needs to be on the network. So in other words, the answer to bikes and scooters is yes. It gets complicated because you may be willing to provide a $5 subsidy for a vehicle, but you may not want to provide I don't know. The complexity is the amount of the subsidy. But in any case, if it's on the network, because we're only end to end. So in other words, if a scooter is picked up at point A, and I don't care what happens in the meantime, and it ends at point B, and we know that because it's picked up at one and it's released at the other, then we can provide the subsidy based on where it was left, because maybe somebody's taken it from their home to a train station and there's a subsidy to go to the train station, then it will be applied that way. So the answer is yes. Yep. We handle them, and
again, it's just another ride provider, and as long as we have origin and destination data, and the city or the transportation manager wants to offer a subsidy for that type of ride, it's completely the same as any other ride provider. So I'm moving on to another question here. This is a good one from Doug Parker. Innisville, and this is around the cost increase in Innisville and the fact that now it's exceeding their budget. It's so popular that people are riding it beyond their budget. So the question, I'm going to see what the question is. So solution would seem to be having the data to know where and how to focus achieving more ride sharing. Are there features of this platform to help with this?
There are, so there's a lot to that question, and
Yeah.
I do not like caps and limits. That's just a personal distaste that I have, and I'm so unhappy that they decide to limit it to a certain number per month. Or I don't mind that they reduced it by $1. But I do mind that they capped it, because if I need to use it 40 times a month because I need to go back and forth to work, and you've only given me 30, then I got to go buy a car. And so I don't. That's why I don't like caps. That's one reason. Um, we provide two kinds of. We provide many reports, but one of the reports is, um, for example, we can tell the ride providers that if they had provided, for example, they had an opportunity to provide larger vehicles for more pooling, or they could have stationed vehicles differently, or they could have a different number of sized vehicles. For example, if the vehicles are subsidized by occupancy, it may be that their fleet should have smaller vehicles in them, because we do occupancy not by count of person, but we do occupancy by fullness of vehicle. So if you have a 8-person vehicle, it's half full with 4 people. But if you have a 2-person vehicle, it's half full with 1 person, for example. So there's ways to have the ride providers adjust their fleet positioning and location and counts and drivers and sizes, for example. And there's also, it may be the case that we can indicate that had the subsidy been 50% higher, that they would have increased their ridership by 30% or something like that. So we can provide information to both sides so as to optimize fleets and to optimize subsidies.
Perfect. All right, I'm just going to go down the list, Bern. I have uh, another question from Carol Atkinson, and I don't see, she's got a hyphenated extended name, but I don't see that, so sorry, Carol. Many cities seem to have limited data on ride-hailing activity as well as pricing. Do you envisage them being in a position to understand what subsidies/fees they would need to charge?
So we do not set those subsidies. We're not, it's just not appropriate for us to say what those are. We have ideas about how to determine them. There's techniques that were pioneered in parking in Los Angeles and San Francisco, for example, and that is that we can set out a subsidy and then we can move it up and down a little bit. But that's kind of a crude way to go about it. We think that there are ways to start intelligently by using certain kinds of studies that would be academic studies. Other parties would do that. It may be that, for example, you look at what other cities have done and say, wow, that city did $3 and that city increased transit by 12%. Why don't we try that, for example? So there's a lot of ways. It's a little bit trial and error, I think, in that regard. But what happens over time when many cities are doing this is that we learn from each other. And it just may be that if one city was offering, let's take the Innisfil example, and they were offering $5 for a certain thing and they lowered it to $4, but it didn't change anything. There's a lot of information in that. Or all of a sudden they moved it from 5 to 4 and the user just dropped off altogether. So I think we're going to learn from what other cities do is one of the ways to learn it. And the only way we learn that is to have a lot of cities engage in this kind of approach. I wish I just knew how to calculate that, but I don't.
So I'm going to just keep going down the list, Bern. Doug Parker is asking, can this be set up to restrict subsidies to trips to specific destinations like transit connections and detect if they just instead switch to a chained TNC trip to some other place?
So it's easy to say you you said you were going from your home to someplace. You were going from someplace to the train station, and it's easy to tell that you got off at the train station. What it sounds like you're saying is then you just get out and hail another one and then go to visit your friend. So that's possible to detect. If you took a subsidy both ways, we would have to aggregate those. The problem is that's a little bit privacy invasive in a sense. I need it. So that can be done mathematically. I just think it would take some thoughtful questioning before we would do something like that. I mean, one of the cities that we're working with said, we will pay for our citizens to be dropped off at the train station, but I need to know that they took the train. And so they require us to go into the transit account of that person and see if they got off at a certain time, that within 20 minutes they got on a train at that place. Give them time to get a coffee in between. And we said yes to that. So that is a way to ensure that a person that got a subsidy to go to the train station took the train. But that doesn't, well, that solves the problem if we interface with that system.
Yeah.
But that's, each time there's work each time.
So
Sorry, again, an almost answer.
yeah, it's an almost answer. So there's another good question here from Fabrizio. Do you currently have access or an access agreement to any TNC APIs? I would assume you need this in order to operate as a clearinghouse.
Yes, we need, yes, we do need that. And we are in discussion with TNCs and taxi companies as well. And we don't have any signed agreements yet. But we can't just do that because they're not going to, no one would offer a discounted ride unless they know they're getting money. So that's why that communication is critical.
Yeah, and several of the cities that we're working with are kind of bringing the TNCs to the table as part of how they want to operate. And so the TNCs have not said to us, no, we're not going to give you access, because really, in this circumstance, we are actually bringing them business and subsidized business.
I want to underscore that we don't have to have access to their data. What has to happen is that we need to turn over the ride. Say, well, here's a ride for you, and here's a token for that ride. What we need to do is have you tell us later, given token so-and-so, yes, we dropped them off at such and so. So it's not access to them telling us anything. It's they confirm that the ride started at a certain point and ended it. So they're really confirming a ride. It's all they're doing. But they have to do that. Otherwise we can't invoice them. Sorry, we can't invoice the city on their behalf.
Right.
It's actually very simple. What we do is actually quite straightforward from the perspective of the TNCs. All the complexity is with the city. I don't mean the city people, but all the complexity is for the city, for the reporting, and for the subsidies, and for the database. All the complexity is really within our platform, which is where it belongs.
So speaking of complexity, I have another good question, and I know that we are winding down to the end of the hour. So let's talk about this for a minute. What's the plan for privacy? Cell providers and GPS, let alone Google Trips, match this with HMS, and governments could match all that data up very easily.
What we do is we keep the data only that's needed to confirm the subsidy. So we need to know when from point A at a certain time to point B at a certain time, and they got on the train or not. And that information is passed on. It can be passed on same second to the city if we have that kind of relationship. It can be passed on weekly. But when it's passed on, then the city says, we got it. And we have an agreement with the city that says, once you've sent us the data, delete it or not, or keep it for a month or whatever they ask us to do. We don't use that data for any other purpose other than confirming the subsidy. And we are willing to delete and be, what's the word? And to have an independent party confirm that deletions have occurred. So we can actually delete it same second. However, what we don't do is we don't have any say over what the city does with it. So if the city has that data in order to pay the subsidies, we have no control over what the city does. As would any ride provider who turns over whatever they do turn over for the city, they don't have control over that.
Okay, and I'm just working my way down the list, Bern. Okay, so here's a good one from Jeff Becker. For-hire providers are extremely competitive, and some, like Uber, are already trying to be the one-stop shop. What are the incentives in brackets, benefits, regulations for joining this platform? Coordinating on-demand services has been notoriously difficult.
So the incentives are all on the transit authority side to begin with. When a transit authority says we're going to put out X $100,000 of incentives to ride providers for these following several activity or these several types of rides, then the incentive is that the access to that money is by joining the platform. I don't think anybody should have to join any platform. If a TNC says no, then I think that's up to them.
Yeah, it's worth repeating that this platform is a platform that is used by the transit agency to specify and regulate what they want to have happen or how they want to collaborate with private ride providers like Uber and Lyft. And so it's up to the ride provider to really join in, and it's up to the transit agency to define what those incentives are in order to connect the two, kind of the private and the public together. All right, so we've got a few more minutes left, and I've got one more question here. I'm just going to go to that. Your initial slides talked about how certain for-hire vehicles have increased vehicle miles traveled in cities. It is not clear how your solution whereby for-hire vehicles are subsidized would not increase VMT. How does your tool capture VMT to make sure subsidizers are not increasing VMT and, example, congestion on their very own transit networks?
So we are not guaranteeing to reduce VMT. One thing that does occur is that the extra VMT comes from a few things. I mean, it comes from people who were otherwise going to use transit or otherwise going to walk or bike. That's extra VMT. If you were going to take your own car, then there's extra VMT because some car had to deadhead to get to you. One thing that this does, if there's multiple providers and a rider says, I just need a ride to get from A to B, give me the closest one, which we can do, then the deadheading is reduced. So there's an opportunity to reduce, but that's not to wipe it out. I don't think you can, I mean, that's one way. Sorry, there is a second way, and that is that depending on how ride pooling is subsidized, in other words, if in Innisfil, it's only subsidized if there's ride pooling. If you only subsidize ride pooling, and it's really remarkably different, it's $3 to get from A to B as opposed to $11. Well, okay, I'll pool. That's really a huge difference. It's bigger than even the difference that's already offered. If that's the case, then that would reduce VMT as well, relatively speaking. We're not going to take away the problem of people preferring to motor over walk or bike. If that's, I mean, that's going to be endemic. As long as you make any system that's better, especially autonomous vehicles, if they're cheaper and so forth, that is a risk throughout. So that's why we think pricing should be used. We think that very, very short trips like 2 blocks should not be subsidized unless you're a senior or disabled, for example. But those are just opinions that we have. So the shaping of this subsidy, the distances and the places, all have to consider the question that was just asked. It's a non-trivial question, and you can't just throw it out by throwing out a subsidy. You can't, these are complicated problems. So ours is a tool, not an answer.
Yeah. So I'm gonna cut you off right there, Bern, and I want to thank everybody for joining us. We've come to the end of the webinar. I am going to share a PDF version of the slides presented today to everybody who attended, and of course you have our contact information. If you have more questions or you want to hear a little bit more about what we're up to, please reach out. And other than that, just thanks a lot for giving us an hour of your time. We really appreciate it. Anything else on closing, Bern?
Oh no, thank you, thank everybody. Whoa, that's my fire alarm. I can't stop that.
All right, maybe I can find a way to mute Bern.
Yeah, mute me.
All right, so Bern is muted, and again, thanks everyone for being part of our webinar, and we'll look forward to talking to you soon. Bye for now.
All right.